Sally Hemings, a slave of Jefferson who's received a lot of attention. You write about this in the book, but there's an alleged inappropriate sexual relationship that perhaps is even long-standing that Jefferson has with this slave, Sally Hemings. I went on the history.com, History Channel website just this morning to see uh, what we are still able to easily access online about this issue. And this is what history.com says. There is much evidence to suggest, if not prove conclusively, that Jefferson had a long-standing relationship with a slave named Sally Hemings, and that the two had at least one and perhaps as many as 6 children together. What do you have to say about that?
Let me say how I want to say. That's a rumor that's been out there since 1801. 1801, Thomas Jefferson becomes president, and there was a guy named James T. Callender who had come from Scotland to America. He was persecuted by the British in Scotland. He wrote things there against the government that made them mad, and so he came to America. When he came to America, people like Jefferson, Madison, others said, "Hey, you got kids here and you don't have a job. We'll give you some temporary relief for your kids." And they made contributions to him. And they said, if the British government doesn't like you, we probably do, because that was our relationship with the British back then. So they got him set up in a publishing house, and he became an author there. And because Jefferson and others had been nice to him, he ended up being what was known as an anti-federalist. That's the party of Jefferson. So he starts writing all these articles, smashing George Washington, smashing Alexander Hamilton, smashing John Adams, who are the Federalists, because that's got to be Jefferson's enemies. He's an anti-Federalist, so they're Federalists. And I mean, they were outrageous articles. What he claimed that George Washington did, that George Washington had gone in and corrupted all the judges, and he's bribing these guys and whatever. I mean, he's just throwing the stuff off the wall like crazy, just making stuff up. And so it got so bad that as he was writing in Philadelphia, the government came after him for libel and sedition and other things. And so he fled down to Richmond, Virginia, down close to Jefferson, and kept writing down there. And then when Jefferson got elected president, he went to Jefferson and said, "Hey, I'm the one who got you elected president because of all this writing I've been doing about you. I want you to make me the postmaster over Richmond, because I'm dating a girl right now, and she would really be impressed if I was postmaster of Richmond. So you just make me postmaster." And Jefferson and Madison both said, "No, you're not even qualified for that." So when they told him no, that he couldn't get that presidential appointment, he then said, "Well, I'll show you." And so he became a Federalist at that point. He joined a Federalist newspaper. He starts writing about Jefferson. And this is where he starts saying, "Oh, there's a slave on the plantation, Sally. And, it's rumored that Jefferson's sleeping with Sally, and her first son is named Tom. And that's because she respects Thomas so much that she named her first son after." And so he does the same thing, going after Jefferson. And 1801, 1802, 1803, he just writes all the stuff about Jefferson, just outrageous stuff. He dies in 1803. He gets drunk. He drowns in 3 feet of water in the James River. Accidental death is what the coroner ruled it. And so at that point in time, it pretty much all goes away. And even the people who hated Jefferson, the Federalists, like Henry Lee, a big Federalist, they went to the papers and said, "All this stuff about Jefferson is nonsense. We know Jefferson, and none of this stuff happened, and that's not who he is. This guy is just a crazy writer." So even Jefferson's enemies exonerated him and said, "We know him too well, and that's just not the case." What happens is in 1998, Science magazine, Nature magazine, and a joint thing, they came out with an announcement, and it was written by historian Joseph Ellis out of Mount Holyoke University, and said, "Hey, we now have DNA evidence that shows that Thomas Jefferson did father those children to Sally Hemings, and DNA evidence now proves it." And so that made the press over the next 2 weeks. 211 articles were written about that nationwide, that DNA now proves Jefferson did it. And we were curious, so we called the DNA guy who did the test. Eugene Foster did the DNA test. And in talking to Eugene, he says, "No," he said, "it didn't prove it." He said, "I told them that it didn't prove it, and they went ahead and wrote that article anyway." It turns out that the guy who wrote the article, and by the way, Eugene Foster did a second DNA test that also came back and didn't prove it. And the easiest way to say it didn't prove it is because they didn't use Thomas Jefferson's DNA in the test. Now, you would think if you want to prove Jefferson did it, that you'd use his DNA. They didn't, because you can't, because Jefferson did not have any sons that lived to manhood. You have to take the male descendants of DNA to be able to test that. He had 5 daughters, 1 son. His 1 son died when he was less than a year old. There was nobody to test. So what they did was they went to other Jeffersons in Virginia and took their DNA. Well, that's all right, but there's 26 Jefferson males that lived around Monticello and 10 of them that lived on Monticello. And way back in the day, in the 1800s, 1801 too, way back then, they said Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, was sleeping with the slaves. Well, that's not Thomas. Even back then, they had it identified as someone else. And so what happened was they never used Jefferson's DNA. And after this thing was all over and done with, and by the way, it appears the reason this came out was the guy who wrote this article, Joseph Ellis, he had signed on to a full-page ad in the New York Times because Bill Clinton was being impeached at the time for sleeping with or having sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky in the White House. And the thought was, if Jefferson had stuff, he turned out to be a good president. We just need to let people know that Bill Clinton is like Jefferson. And if it didn't affect Jefferson, it won't affect Bill Clinton. And so they went a lot further past. And it's interesting, the time that they announced that the DNA actually didn't prove it was after Clinton was off the impeachment. After that was over and done with, they said, oh, by the way, we're doing a recall of our story that Jefferson slept with Hemmings.
They did recall it.
They did recall it. Nature and Science both recalled it. Said,
who pays attention to that? Who pays attention to the recall months after, right?
And I'm telling you, Matt, we get these college kids in over the summer, and we still ask them today, more than 20 years later, say, how many of you have been told that Jefferson slept with his slave, Sally Hemings? All the hands go up. We're still teaching today that DNA proved that, and it did not prove it. And so it's interesting. After it was all the furor kind of slowed down, they took 13 PhD professors and put them on a blue ribbon panel and said, you guys look at all the evidence that's out there, see what you think. And those professors believed that Jefferson had slept with Hemings until they researched all the evidence and came back, and they all unanimous said Jefferson didn't do it. The evidence is on the other side. So that's one of the things as well, is we get some really bad reporting because of political positions, not because of truth. And that goes back to the premise, we want truth more than we want positions.